Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone back here tonight. If you were not with us last week or are wondering where we are at, we will be picking up in Daniel chapter 9 this evening. Now, if you take a look at the question handouts, you'll notice that the goal, and I stress that word, goal, is to get through chapters 9 and 10, because I really want to have, in the last couple of weeks, enough time to get through chapters 11 and 12. And 11, there's some doing on that one. When we think of what we talked about last time, almost said last week, but last time, we were looking at Daniel chapter 8, and we saw a vision there of a ram and a goat. And the ram was representative of the Medo-Persians, having two horns to represent the two kingdoms that became one empire. And then you have the goat that had one very large horn, slayed the ram, and that was the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, representing the large horn. And then what happened to the horn, for those of you who can remember 2 weeks ago? It broke apart and it became four smaller horns, representing the death of Alexander, and how after the death of Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire split up into four parts. And then we looked at, there was a particular little horn that popped up, and we talked about some possibilities of what that was. But at the end of the day, the main point was to show, for Daniel to see a description of the future that was going, and what was going to happen, to show that God was in control. There were some very mighty things that were going to be persecuted upon the Jewish nation, such as the temple not providing sacrifices and being shut up, and having abominations and desolations done upon the temple grounds. And those are things that can be very worrying, but the assurance was, this is part of God's plan, God is in control, and at the end of the day, the little horn will face the judgment of God. He will perish, his reign will not be eternal, and God will be victorious in the end. And that brings us to chapter 9, where chapter 9 is a little bit different than the last two chapters we've covered, because most of it is not a vision. Chapters 7 and 8 have been all about these visions Daniel's been receiving, but chapter 9 starts out a little bit differently. And I want us to we're just going to read a couple of verses here in the first 23 verses. We're going to skip a lot of the first 23 verses. I'll get to why in a moment. But the first thing I want us to look at are the first two verses. Carrie, would you mind reading verses 1 and 2 of Daniel chapter 9, please?
In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem.
Thank you. Okay, so something here, not only is this the first of the prophecies of since chapter 7 that takes place during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire, but also more significantly for us is that section in verse 2. What is Daniel referencing in verse 2? Go ahead, Carrie.
The prophecy that the Jews would spend 70 years in captivity and then return to their homeland.
Right. Now, as something to remember, I'm not going to expect anyone to remember all the way back to the first class that we did. But there are three prophets that are all prophesying around the same time as Daniel, roughly, especially when Daniel first starts. You have Jeremiah, you have Daniel, and you have Ezekiel. And they're all in three different, very different settings. Ezekiel is among the exiled people in Babylon. Daniel, of course, is in the courts of Babylon, and you have Jeremiah, who is with the remnant that remains in Jerusalem and that remains in Judah over those various stages of captivity that we also talked about at the end of 2 Kings. So Jeremiah is a contemporary. This is something Daniel would be reading and hearing news of. And he sees Jeremiah's prophecy that for 70 years there will be captivity. Now, let me ask you something. We've been very clear over the last couple of weeks that we should be leery when we see numbers. Should this be another number that we are leery of, whether or not it's literal or metaphorical or symbolic? Why do you think it's literal?
Just because it's being referenced, like Daniel, it's just contained in there as far as all the numbers, but he's referencing someone else.
Okay, he's referencing someone else, and also notice, this isn't a vision. This isn't a prophecy. This is outside of that. Daniel is referencing something that he himself read, and he understands it to be 70 years. Literal years. And what that prompts, and what we're not really going to read much of, is a prayer or supplication towards God that essentially is Daniel pleading on the behalf of the nation of Israel to relent the time in captivity earlier than 70 years. He thinks that they have suffered enough, and if you're curious on the exact timeline on that, it's probably been, there's discussion on the exact time frame, but it's probably been about 30 to 35 years. Most scholars sort of put Daniel chapter 9 taking place around halfway through the captivity mark. Somewhere right in there. So they've been in captivity for a bit. And so when Daniel says this prayer, he's pleading God, saying, God, we've had enough. We've suffered enough. If it be thy will to show your glory, would you relent the calamity, bring us back to Jerusalem before the 70 years is up? And I encourage you yourselves to read verses really 3 all the way down through verse 19. And read that on your own if you have any sort of inclination, because it's an extremely valuable prayer. And if we had more time to spend on it, we would really go through the various parts and look at how Daniel prays that prayer and what he asks for and the humility that he shows in that prayer and how he asks for things, and see the wonderful examples there. But I encourage you to read it on your own and look at it as a possible template or example of how we can speak in our own prayers. Janine?
Back in chapter 8, down in verse 17, wasn't he alluding there to the end of the Jewish regime? The end shall be the vision.
Yes, that the vision pertains to the time of the end. There is a lot, and we'll kind of talk about that when we get further into chapter 9, is we have visions that pertain to the end of the Jews being the chosen nation of God, to the end of their status as God's people, but also, some could argue, to the end of time as well. But that's something to keep in mind, Janine, as we get into the latter part of chapter 9, because there's going to be a lot of future that will be revealed. So, getting back into chapter 9 as well, I do want us to read just the last portion of Daniel's prayer. I want us to read to give us just a sense of some of the things that Daniel is saying. Let's start in verse 17. So now, O God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his supplications, and for your sake, O Lord, let your face shine on your desolate sanctuary. O my God, incline your ear and hear, open your eyes and see our desolation, and the city which is called by your name, for we are not presenting our supplications before you before you on account of any merits of our own, but on account of your great compassion. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and take action. For your own sake, O my God, do not delay, because your city and your people are called by your name. Daniel there shows a lot of humility, and one of the things when you read the prayer, he spends a lot of time saying, we deserve this calamity. We deserve this captivity. For our sins and our idolatry, this is something that we deserve. But please, God, show mercy and compassion. And don't do it because we merit it. I love what he says there in verse 18. Do not do this because of merits of our own, but because you are compassionate. We come to you not asking for things because we deserve you to answer our prayers, but we give unto you supplication because we know that you are compassionate and willing to forgive and to give unto us things that we do not deserve. And without going on to a whole lesson on prayer, there's so much of a proper heart and attitude that Daniel demonstrates just in that verse, but throughout that prayer, that I think we can all sort of look at and emulate and understand how Daniel is asking for something from the Lord. It's not because he thinks he deserves something. It's because he knows that God is willing to overlook the flaws of man. He shows humility in his confession of such things. And most importantly, he says, God, don't do this because I deserve it, because Israel deserves it, but do it because it brings glory unto you. Do it because of your great compassion. And it's a wonderful template and a wonderful way to show how we should pray, and I've probably spent too much time on it already. But to move us along before we get any too far deeper on that, verses 20 through 23, Daniel receives an answer, in a sense. And an angel appears to him. An angel that we have seen already in chapter 8, the angel Gabriel, but he appears as a man. And very quickly, I want us to read verses 22 and 23. Autumn, would you mind reading verses 22 and 23 for me, please, of chapter 9?
He made me understand, speaking with me, and saying, O Daniel, I am now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your plea for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision.
All right, thank you. So, the only reason I want to highlight this is because, one, we see that prayers are listened to, but number two, Daniel prays this prayer, God brings an answer, and it sets up the context of verses 24 through 27. In verse 23, what is the angel coming to give Daniel? Why was he sent? To provide insight, right. That's not a trick question. There's something that Daniel has asked in his prayer. He wants to know about the future, though he doesn't say that explicitly, but he's saying, God, I want us to come to the end of our captivity. I want to go back to the land. We have suffered. Please, Lord, end our calamity now. That's the essence of what he is asking for in his prayer. And then the angel comes to him and says, I bring to you a message, and I'm going to give you understanding of this message and vision. And it's in a response to what Daniel has prayed for, but as a lesson that you learn a lot in the Old Testament, be very careful what you pray for, because the answer might be not quite exactly what you're expecting. Might be not as straightforward of an answer either. One of my favorite examples of that is the book of Habakkuk. But anyway, let's look at the vision that he gets here at the end of chapter 9. Let's see. Blake French, would you mind reading verses 24 through 27, please?
24 through 27.
Yes, sir.
70 weeks have I been decreed from your people, your holy city, to finish the transgression.
All right, thank you. So we get an answer, but it's not really a straightforward answer. But Daniel does receive an answer from God to his prayer. Now, I want us to first look at verse 24 a little bit deeply. And I want you to look at verse 24 and then look at verse 2. Is there anything there that that seems just subtly different?
One's 70 days and one's 70 weeks.
Well, 70 years in verse 2. You got me confused for a second. I go, 70 years in verse 2, and then when we get to verse 24, it says 70 weeks. Now, this, again, is that principle that we have been hammering, which is that even though Daniel knows it's 70 years, in the prophecy, it's 70 weeks. Now, we know what the answer is, that it's 70 years, but now that we're in prophecy language, now that we're in visions, notice that we're no longer saying 70 years, we're saying 70 weeks. And some of you might say, well, okay, God, God just wants to make sure that we're paying attention, or something to that effect, or, it doesn't really matter, that's just a small detail. But it's because it's there that I think it is significant that we understand this is a principle that God is reinforcing. Be very careful of taking numbers as literal when they are inside of a vision. There's clear demarcation in verse 2 that this is not a vision. This is what Daniel has seen and read. And then in verse 24, we are in a vision given by the angel Gabriel. Easy thing to miss, but that also sets up, when we go a few more verses, when it starts talking about 70 weeks and 62 weeks and 62 weeks again, that we have to be very careful to say, okay, that cannot be, or that should not be, and is not something that is literal. And I do apologize if I sound like a broken record, but man, there's a lot of people who miss this when they read these chapters. And it's really important, in my opinion, that we are shored up on that understanding, because it makes prophecy easier and the interpretation thereof easier in your own studies, in my opinion. Now, moving on from that, what is God saying is going to happen in 70 weeks in verse 24? Transgression will be finished, so they will go back and they will begin to rebuild. Their captivity will be finished. As Janine just said, the transgression that they are facing, or the punishment for their transgression, will be over, and they will return back to Jerusalem, to Israel, and there will be a time of atonement, bring in everlasting righteousness. And then in verse 25, you are to know and discern that from the issue of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So, this is something interesting. Put yourself in the shoes of Daniel, or in the shoes of an Israelite at this time. What did the temple mean? Solomon's temple. If you were a Jew during that time, how did you view Solomon's temple? Gary?
That was their identity as a nation.
It was their identity as a nation. Okay. Anyone else? It was the center of their religious life. I like that. That was not only their identity was the temple, it is how we show that we are close to God. He has built a temple in Jerusalem, and that it shows that we are his people. And it is the center of their religious life, as Ian pointed out. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes, he destroys the temple, melts all the gold down, utterly ruins and sacks the city. And then Daniel is told it will be rebuilt. You will have time to rebuild. There will be a decree to rebuild. Now, if you've read Ezra and Nehemiah recently, or you will know that that is indeed what happens, but it never quite hits the former glory of Solomon's temple, but it is still rebuilt. So this is a somewhat, in verse 24 and 25, we're talking about the near future. And this is where Daniel gets really tricky, because in one sentence, we're both talking about the near future within another 40 or so years, 40 to 50 years, and then we jump all the way to what? Until Messiah the Prince. That's a pretty big time jump. But what do you think is significant? We've already established that the 62 weeks is not meant to be taken literally. Then what do you think it does mean that saying that there's, not 62 weeks, 7 weeks and 62 weeks? What do you think that might be pertaining to? What could be the significance of that number there? Between the time to rebuild and then when the Messiah comes. Why that number? So let's think about this. If we were to say something is 7 weeks and 62 weeks away, or 69 weeks away, does that feel like it's many years away, or does that still sound relatively close? Sounds relatively close. And that's simply what the number is there to evoke within us, is in a short time from when you go to rebuild, there's going to be a short gap of time, and then the Messiah will come. It is imminent after you go back to Jerusalem, after the temple is rebuilt. The time for the Messiah will be near. Now, what's the catch? Well, not quite 500, but, 500-ish years away, if to use a very broad estimation. But yeah, 500 years-ish away. But what do we know? Who wants to give the verse? Who knows where I'm getting at with this? 1,000 years is like what to God? One day. So if we're looking at this from God's perspective, who's giving the vision, 69 weeks, or 7 weeks and 62 weeks, is not a very long amount of time. It's close. It's near in God's perspective. Now, 500 years, that's a long way for us, but again, we're talking about a different perspective here. And again, what's difficult is that's all within one verse, that we go from 40 years away to 500 years away, and then in verse 26, we go further still. Before we continue, any comments or questions? Ian?
Give much thought to the 70 times 7, making it 490.
Ah,
70 times 62, and that sort of thing.
okay. So let's tackle that for a second, because that...
Because the Hebrew term there was sevens, not
Yes.
weeks. It can be used as weeks, as it is many times throughout the Old Testament, but that's a literal 7.
Yes. So, Ian brings us to a point that I wanted to make. I was hoping someone would bring it up to segue me into it. You didn't disappoint, Ian. Seven is a very significant number, and multiples of 7 is a very significant number in Jewish numerology. And anytime you see the number 7 and it is used in a metaphorical way, it usually is referring to completeness. 7 is the number of perfection or completeness. When we see in verse 24, 70 weeks, that is denoting to us symbolically remember this was written to the Jews, so they would understand this numerology, understand this symbolism, in that 70 weeks, that is a complete amount of time because it is a multiple of 7. When we see 7 times 7, or 70 times 7, excuse me, whenever we see something that involves the number 7 in a prophecy, in something that is symbolic, think to yourself, okay, this is a complete and perfect amount of time. It's not an exact amount of time that we know, but it is a time that is known to God, and it will be the perfect and correct amount of time. That's something, again, that is important in understanding. If you're going to look at these numbers, the Jews understood this. We're reading someone else's mail or someone else's vision in this particular circumstance. This was not meant for Americans in 2024 when it was originally written. Now, we can understand it, and it is made so that we can see something here. I'm not saying it's completely useless. It's written down for all time for a reason. But we have to do a little bit of background work because the Jews would have understood this because it was a part of their culture. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other comments or questions before we move forward? Yes, Ian.
Not to drag this way off into the weeds, so feel free to shut me up if that's the case. If you add the 62 and the 7,
Yep.
you get 69.
Right.
You were just shy
Of
the completion of that perfection,
Yes.
right? And so you have all this tumultuousness and destruction going on within that 69 weeks, if you will,
Mhm.
that's forecasted to come. And then this completion, this 70 weeks occurs. Is this perhaps a much larger time frame as well as a weird time frame?
Let me ask you.
An eschatological type of
Let me answer your question with a question. And if you were to think, when would be the complete or perfected amount of time in something that the Messiah does, that the Messiah the Prince does? When would be the completed work or time frame of what the Messiah has come to accomplish? I wouldn't say judgment.
some pushback, but I would tend to, in light of this, the second coming,
Okay?
because it is incomplete if you are still waiting for all of your children to turn to you. I still have sheep that I need to go and find.
That's possible. I would give an alternative answer. I would say that if we look at what the Messiah came to accomplish on this earth as a man, being born and begat into this world, his goal was completed when he died, was on the cross, and was resurrected for the forgiveness of all of man's sins so that salvation could be perfected through Christ and could be the head of the church and all of that. That would be, to me, the complete amount of time of the Messiah the Prince. 69 weeks would then indicate to me his birth. The beginning of the time that the Messiah the Prince arrives on earth, and then the completion of his time upon earth. Because I do not think that we're going as far as the second coming yet. And I don't want to get too much further into those weeds. If someone wants to talk to me about it afterwards, we can. In fact, I do want to make just one more point on this as we go down to verse 27. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. There can be discussion of, is this talking about this particular point in time, this particular point in time, this particular point in time? Could it be referring to the destruction of Jerusalem? Could it be referring to the time of Nero? Could it be referring to the second coming, to Judgment Day? It's not even focus on that. Focus on the point. And the overall point that this whole answer that Gabriel gives is, Daniel, here's what the future is going to be. You are going to get, the Israelites are going to get to go home. The temple will be rebuilt. The Messiah will come shortly after that. And then the Messiah's time will be completed. And then there will be some strife and struggle and a time of desolation. It's a timeline. It's what Daniel has continued to receive in all of these visions and prophecies. A timeline. And what are the point of these timelines? To show that God is in control. That, Daniel, things are going to get bad. Things will be bad. But it's all right. I am in control. This is not something I do not see coming. This will happen. But don't be afraid. Because I've got it. I've got it in my hands. And it will not take me off guard. And Daniel is getting an answer to his question. He wants to know about the future. Well, God gives it to him. But there's some of it that is even going to be hard for Daniel to really understand without some of the context that we have now. I apologize for moving a little bit quickly, but to getting into chapter 10. And in chapter 10 is the start of essentially the end of Daniel. Chapters 10, 11, and 12 are all one prophecy. That takes place in the time of Cyrus, the king of Persia, which is the king to come after Darius, in the third year of Cyrus, as we see in verse 1. A message comes to Daniel. Now, chapters 10, 11, and 12 are all about this message. Chapter 10, though, is setting up that message. And Daniel is going to witness some things and go through a lot of great physical distress. To highlight that, starting in verse 3 of Daniel chapter 10. Or verse 2, excuse me. In those days, I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment at all until 3 weeks were completed. He is going through a great deal of physical stress, and then he sees a vision. In verse 6, his body, this is what he sees. Someone like a man, and in verse 6, his body also was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. Now I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great dread fell on them, and they ran away to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw the great vision, yet no strength was left in me, for my natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. But I heard the sound of his words, and as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. I want to make a quick point here. Why, in your opinion, do you think that the story shows us the physical difficulties Daniel goes through when he sees this figure, when he sees this angel? Why is that recorded? I mean, yeah, it's interesting detail and imagery, but is that all it's there for? Go ahead. The awesomeness, the terror is unimaginable. Let's build on that a little bit. I think you're 100% right. One of the things that I think some places that preach Christ miss is there's a lot of positivity saying, Christ is all about love, mercy, and grace. And that's all you kind of hear. And it's places like this that I think we all have to remember there's a little bit of uncomfortability that we have to remember that comes along with God. Angels are terrifying beings in that when they show themselves in their angelic form and not in a human form, they are inhuman, monstrous, and awesome in the true meaning of that word, inspiring of awe, and terrifying. Because they hold with them the power, they come with a modicum of the power of God and the authority that God has given them over the world, that they can wreak such desolation to wipe a city, 2 cities off the face of the earth in a night with no trace. Passages like this, I think sometimes we get lost and say, okay, yeah, imagery, angels are scary. But the reason that these sort of passages exist, in my opinion, is they help us to remember reverence. It's very easy, I think, sometimes to get lost in just God is all loving and all caring and forget that there is an awesome power. And that there's a terrifying power that comes with God. And the angels are a reminder of that. And I'm not saying, be terrified all the time of God. No. But don't forget that there is reverence that we all must show. Even Daniel, who has been nothing but a great servant to God, still is terrified at the sight of this because it's scary. Because the power is humbling, and this is really where we get the idea of reverence from. There is a healthy fear that we sometimes have to remind ourselves of when it comes to God. Now, we're not going to get through the whole of chapter 10. Looking at the time, that's my fault. But I do want us to hit what I think will take up the rest of our time here. Todd Rogers, would you mind reading verses 11 through 14 for me, please?
He said to me, Daniel, you are the man treasured by God. Understand the word that I am saying to you. Stand on your feet, for I have now been sent to you. After he said this to me, I stood trembling. Don't be afraid, Daniel, he said to me. From the first day that you proposed to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your prayers were heard. I have come because of your prayers. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me after I had been left there with the kings of Persia. Now I have come to help you understand what will happen to your people in the last days, for the vision refers to those days.
All right, thank you. And then also skip down to verse 20. Then he said, do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia, so I am going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. One of the interesting parts of this, that really the point of the angel, when you read this chapter in its entirety, this chapter is setting up that the angel is delivering a vision. Daniel has been the one who is appointed to know the times and epochs of the future, because he is one whom God values very highly, and he is going to be the one that is given this information, and the angel is here to provide that information. But the part where I think many of us latch on to in this chapter are the parts that we just read, chiefly verses 13, 14, and verse 20, is this idea of the angel talking about warring with the prince of Persia, needing aid, or the king of Persia, the princes of Persia needing aid from another angel who is named as a chief angel named Michael, and how there is this battle going on that the angels are engaged in. Now, I think we can take this way, way too far, and to quote Larry from 2 weeks ago, or Larry Robbins, what does it matter? At the end of the day, not much, in that if we're really going to spend all this time, let's talk about angels. Is there a hierarchy? Is, what's an archangel? What's this? And get really deep into it. One, we don't have the time, and two, it's just knowledge for the sake of knowledge sometimes, and speculation for the sake of speculation. Which, don't get me wrong, I enjoy that. But it's very easy to get lost in it. I think there's a major point that why God tells us this, because this is one of the first places. Anyone think of another passage in the New Testament that is somewhat similar to this idea of a war going on behind the scenes? Okay, not the place I was thinking. Let's turn over to Ephesians chapter 6. And Ian, since you spoke up, when you get over there, Ephesians chapter 6 and verses 11 through 13, please.
Clothe yourselves with the full armor of God, so that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world rulers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens. For this reason, take up the full armor of God, so that you may be able to stand your ground on the evil day, and having done everything, to stand.
Thank you. So in verse 12, sort of similar to what we just read in Daniel chapter 10, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and the powers and principalities and the world forces of this darkness. And if you read Ephesians chapter 3, there's also an allusion to powers that are beyond this world in the heavenly realms that God is showing his manifold wisdom to in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 9 through 12. We see that in the New Testament, but we're first given that sort of inclination of something going on behind the scenes in our world that we do not see. Daniel is one of the first places that gives us a true inclination that there is war, that there is something the angels are doing that we do not see, that is going on behind the scenes. Now, some will go in, oh, is there a war of angels and demons that is going on around us that we do not see? And think that's a step too far for these particular verses. But what it does tell us, and why I think it is here, and what significance we can take, and why this matters for us, is it shows us that there are things that are happening that are, one, not meant for us to know. Because if it was meant for us to know, because I'm sure like many of you, you have questions, because I certainly do. I want to know about this battle. I want to know the tactics. I want to know who's winning. I want to know the great fights. But why isn't it there? Exactly, because we don't need it, because it doesn't matter. The point that God is showing here is there's a war going on. I'm fighting. Angels are doing things that you do not see because you don't need to know. Because it doesn't pertain to something that is pertinent for our own personal salvation. And we have our own fight that is constantly going on. There is a war that is being fought that we do not see. In the New Testament, Paul personalizes this to saying that it is going on between us for our soul. And we are active participants in this fight in not a literal sense, but a spiritual sense, in that we equip ourselves and we guard our souls against the schemes and the machination of the devils and the principalities and powers of this world, and in all the things that are listed there in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. But what we see in Daniel is this insight into understanding that once again God is in control. Daniel's about to hear in chapters 11 and 12 a lot of really big, somewhat confusing things that also feel like the world is falling and everything's coming to an end and it's all going to come crashing down. It's terrifying thing to think about, to behold. But this angel is saying, look, there's a war going on you don't see, but God does. And at the end of the day, God will have victory. We have prevailed over the princes of Persia, the kings of Persia. They withstood for a moment, but then God prevails. What is more analogous of the ebbs and flows of our world? Of those that stand against God prevailing for a short amount of time, and then at the end of the day, God prevails. And Ian brought up Revelation. That's pretty much the core message of Revelation, is the world will shudder and make war and make calamity against God, and the world will feel like it is ending, but at the end of the day, God will have victory. And the saints will be protected, and they will have victory in heaven with God. And that's what is being told to Daniel here, is there was victory. There's something going on that you don't see, Daniel, and God is in control. God is keeping you and keeping things going through whatever the angels are doing. And it's going to go the way God wants. So do not be afraid. And we'll talk next week. We're going to finish up verses 20 and 21, or 19 through 21, of Daniel chapter 10. And then we will move into chapter 11. But are there any last comments or quick comments or questions before we end for tonight? All right. Vance, would you mind leading us in a closing word of prayer?